is also a visiting professor at Harvard, but in the Romance Language and Literature department. And he usually works in the University of São Paulo and has published widely on Brazilian history, literature, and culture in general. So, who should start?
You first.
By delegation.
Yeah, by delegation. Yeah. Democratic delegation.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. I am very pleased to be here taking part in this Brazilian art discussion with people that I admire so much. Jane de Almeida, Guy Brad, my friend Elio Gaspari, and of course Cecile Froment that I'm getting to be acquainted with right now. By training, I am a historian of culture, which means that when I approach a subject, I tend to look for patterns of cultural change in historical time. In that sense, in order to understand a particular cultural phenomenon, I tend to figure out broader perspectives in a larger span of time. And then, if the subject is contemporary art, in order to understand it as a historic cultural phenomenon, I will have to go at least 100 years back to the beginning of the 20th century. But don't be scared. I promise you that I'm going to do that in no more than 5 minutes flat. I just need this time frame in order to be able to try to define what contemporary art is all about. Because contemporary art is not just art made today. It is a project, it is an aim, it is a compromise. It's nowadays almost a consensus that among specialists that the origins of contemporary converge to Picasso and Le Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1907 with the birth of Cubism. What the Cubism revolution caused was the blowing up of the visual perspective and the canons of representation, which tied visual arts to the legacy of the Renaissance and the academic art conventions. By abolishing the visual imperative of the perspective, Picasso shattered the pictorial space, allowing any particular object to be perceived as if the viewer was at the same time moving frantically around it, underneath it, above it, inside out, outside in, thus creating a dynamic world that had no more center, stability, regularity, or cohesive unity. The visual reality of Cubism is a dynamic flow of fragments, flexible to assume the most diverse configurations according to the ways by which the viewer would correlate them to their own perceptions and experiences based on daily life of modern urban environments. In that sense, by liberating vision and senses, Cubism also liberated the mind. It's a cultural revolution in its own right. It comes as no surprise then that another revolution was occurring in parallel in the field of sciences and technology. In 1905, Albert Einstein demolished classical Newtonian physics by setting up the principles of general relativity and quantum mechanics. In 1907, De Vries devised the new revolutionary science of genetics. In 1909, Thomson and Milcan established the paragon of 20th century technology, which is electronics. All of it indicated a crucial moment of revolutionary cognitive change with disturbing repercussions on society and politics. That was the reason why Cubism was repressed and suffocated by the outbreak of the First World War. So much so that it remained an incomplete revolution. Other artists would try to take the Cubist project further on. That was the case of the group who called themselves Dada. The Dadaists wanted to expand the visual experiences of Cubism to encompass the entire system of meaning production in Western culture. By the mid-20s, Dada transmuted into Surrealism. The Surrealists strived to expand the Cubist and Dada legacies even further by probing into the inner psychological realms of desire and imagination, on the one hand, and by getting in intimate connection with extra-European cultures on the other. But again, Dada and Surrealism were repressed and suffocated by the outbreak of the Second World War, which meant, therefore, that the Cubist project continued incomplete. After the war, an unseen wave of prosperity and consumption engulfed most of Western Europe, led by the combined effects of the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction projects, and the new administrative techniques based on central planning. Economic growth equated with urban planning, housing, and slumification. It was no wonder then that the focus of cultural criticism converged to the quality of public life in the cities, the politics of memory, place, and daily life. Young artists and intellectuals started worrying about the negative impact that economic and urban rationalization, consumerism, leisure, and the new media, mostly television and publicity, had in undermining social cohesion, community values, citizenship agency, as well as the environment in its three levels: historical, cultural, and natural. As an outcome to these concerns, they set up three lines of critical attack against these recent developments. First, they centered their criticism on the economic system, which promised affluence but delivered inequality. Second, they denounced a cultural system based on the iron triangle of museums, galleries, and the media. Third, they opposed a political system born out of the Cold War based on militarism, intolerance, repression, and colonialism, which had its most tragic expression in the Vietnam War and the military dictatorships around the Third World. In those confrontational times of the 60s and the early 70s, the young artists and intellectuals would disseminate aesthetic attitudes that would challenge the institutional spaces of galleries and museums. That was a consequence of the way by which they despised the greed that led museums and art galleries to see the artwork as a fetish or as a merchandise, or both. By the same token, they scorned the promotion of the artist to the condition of a genius above the ordinary man or woman. As a corollary, they started questioning all the dogmas operating as a glue that bind the principles of art history with the rules of the art market, namely originality, authenticity, motivation, individuality, singularity, permanence, mobility, quality of material, or virtuosity of execution. They became more interested in creating situations and environments rather than objects, and engaging the public more than showing the talents of the artists, in mixing all the arts and media together in great collective performances in open spaces rather than solo exhibitions in private galleries. They wanted people to come to grips with their sensorial and mental conventions, to shake up the cultural prejudices, and to open up their hearts to new possibilities, new sensibilities, and new imaginary dimensions, away from prejudices, self-repression, and conformism. They wanted art to promote democracy and participatory values. They wanted to engage and empower people's perceptions and minds. But again, they were superseded by untoward historical changes of colossal proportions. By the mid-1970s, the combined effects of the oil crisis and the initiatives to deregulate the financial, industrial, and international trade markets resulted in a new configuration which came to be called globalization. Within this new global context, big corporations felt free from state control as well as from the pressures and demands of trade unions and pressure groups. The era of big corporations was born. State-related services and guarantees shrank, public life deteriorated to a stale democracy. Of course, the impact of this new scenario on the arts and culture was devastating. More than ever before, market forces become prevalent. The key figure those days to put up an artistic event became the so-called cultural promoter, the broker whose market contacts permit him or her to get a sponsorship for the event. No sponsorship, no event. As a matter of course, the agent who is inclined to provide the financial support for the event would like to have a say about the kind of art he or she is promoting, since ultimately it must have a positive effect upon the trademark that is going to be associated with it. In other words, art sponsoring became a variety of the practice of marketing and merchandise. It's no wonder then that some of the most crucial procedures of the art circuit came to be controlled, or in fact, to be monopolized by publicity agencies. After all, they are the ones in charge of building up the public image of any corporation. They are the quintessential caretakers of the merchandise. They are the masters of the soft selling. For that purpose, it is in their interest to bring the arts to the center of the media spectacle. For that strategy to work, art must be presented as a scandal or sensationalism, and the artist himself or herself must be promoted into the status of a media celebrity, which, as a consequence, reduces the art public to the passive consumeristic position of the audience of a multimedia mega show, where art glamorizes merchandise and the other way around. This is how art becomes fashionable and an integral part of the fashion industry. I suppose that you are aware about the exhibition that is being presented at the Boston Institute of Contemporary Arts right now. It's called Cars from the Ralph Lauren Collection. I believe that you can guess who the sponsors of that exhibition must be. As far as Brazil is concerned, the situation is pretty much similar. Brazil also had a brilliant generation of young artists which in the 1960s and 70s broke up all taboos, canons and conventions regulating the art system. People like Elio Gaspari and Lydia Clark, well known and whose work was supported and is being promoted by pioneers like Guy Brad by my side. But also people like Rubens Gresham, Silvio Meirelles, Lígia Papin, Mira Schender. Not only these artists were working along the same lines of their colleagues in Europe and the USA, but with regard to some particular procedures and experience, they engaged in inventive and risky endeavors which make their work pragmatic and inspired in other parts of the world. But the changes of the mid-70s and late 70s were felt in Brazil as well, with the same, if not an even more intense impact. The introduction of the so-called cultural incentive bills, Lei de Incentivo Cultural, aiming at making it attractive to corporations to invest in cultural initiatives, created in fact an entirely new business of getting rid of taxation by deviating the money to, so to say, cultural products. Most big corporations, moreover financial corporations, created their own cultural institutes or cultural centers. Free from any kind of official supervision or from the constraints of pressure groups, they are at ease to decide to show or promote whatever they please, or rather, whatever will better serve their marketing and merchandising needs. And for that, they dispose of authentic fortunes in public money. Life never was so easy or so fun, nor was so much champagne consumed in glamorous vernissages and gala nights with full media coverage. For the artists, however, especially for the young, the poor and the unknown, it became almost impossible to get an audience. For them, the state of the art is miserable as never before. For them, the state of the art can only find solace, and the example taken from Elio Gaspari, an artist that survived without ever having to depend either on official or private sponsorship. He assumed as his personal emblem a popular proverb in Brazil that says, "Da adversidade vivemos." We take our livings out of adversity. Inspired by that proverb, young artists will not be alone. Nowadays, almost the whole country is having to rely on those same old and quite wise words. In that sense, at least, art never was so close to the daily lives of ordinary people. That might be a sad position to be, but by no means it is a bad one. That is, probably the most optimistic thing that I can see about it right now.
Thank you, Nicolau. Well, in relation to Nicolau's fantastic historical overview and perspective and critique, I think I have to speak in a slightly more personal way, because my involvement with Brazilian art is a kind of almost 40 years standing now, and it has been a huge part of my life. I think I came into the area of Brazilian art through journalism. I was working as an art critic for the Times in London, and partly through journalism and partly through those kind of meetings with people that turn out to determine one's life. And in the 1960s in London, with a group of friends all in our early 20s, we established a gallery called Signals, which was very interested in trying to gain a kind of global perspective on contemporary art, and not simply to pay attention only to what was happening in, for example, Paris, New York, and European and North American art worlds. And it so happened that we used, on a visit to Paris one day in 1964, I met Sergio Camargo, a sculptor who was living and working in Paris, and through him I heard about, he was very enthusiastic about what was happening in Brazilian art. He was very knowledgeable about European art, and he said, look, something very exciting and original is happening in Brazilian art, and you should really see for yourself. There's people like Elio Gaspari, Mira Schendel, really interesting artists. I took all this in, and the following year, in 1965, I was able to go to Brazil as a representative of the Times, a report on the Sao Paulo Biennale, and on that occasion I met Ligia, Elio, and Mira Schendel, Mira Schendel in Sao Paulo and Ligia and Elio in Rio for the first time. And I also, in visiting Sao Paulo Biennale, where there was a small exhibit of Oiticica's Bolides, which happened to be sort of next door to a big and quite dominant show of American minimalism. There was Barnett Newman, there was Donald Judd, there was Sol LeWitt, a very slickly installed and a pretty dramatic show of minimalism. Well, in keeping with the tradition of the Sao Paulo Biennale, Brazil had in fact been, since the establishment of the Biennale in the early 1950s, the recipient of the latest news, not only the latest news from the contemporary art world, but also a kind of historical education in the 20th century avant-garde. I think the early Sao Paulo Biennales were probably the most comprehensive exhibitions of 20th century art that you could have seen anywhere in the world at the time. Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Mondrian, Malevich, Paul Klee, Boccioni, all were given substantial shows there. Even Guernica, Picasso was shown in Sao Paulo, a thing that not many people may know, that it travelled from New York to Sao Paulo in those years, those 50s. Anyway, I saw these Bolides of Elio's next to the minimalists, and the contrast was really extraordinary. I saw like two sensibilities, two cultures, two histories side by side. The material quality and the colour of the Bolides was, they're modestly sized objects with boxes and glass containers, quite not having nothing of the scale of the American art. but and a sort of intensity and a sensuality that was immediately magnetizing. So I kind of identified very strongly with these works, and I met Elio and met Ligia, and it all began in that way. So I think that there was something very important happening. I think it's taken a long time for the more wider art world, I think, to become aware of just how special that period was in Brazil. Because as we know, it encompassed all the arts and probably all the intellectual disciplines as well. And it actually was also wider. It was also, I think, a Latin American phenomenon, because while Europe was recovering from the war, and the whole experience of the war ushered in a kind of tendency in art, what was identified with anxiety, what was called the geometry of fear by some people, and a kind of existentialist tendency in art, which in some ways blotted out the pre-war avant-garde in the European consciousness. In the Latin American consciousness, it was still very much alive, and Latin America hadn't been through the trauma of the war, had in fact economically benefited to some extent from supplying food and so on to Europe. And so when the young Latin Americans came to Paris, as most young artists would have done in those days, since Paris still had the cachet of an international art center, and also French was often usually the second language of Latin Americans, came there with a desire to meet and get to know the artists of the pre-war avant-garde. Mondrian, who was no longer alive, but they tried to see whether they could see his work, and it wasn't that easy because people were not thinking much about Mondrian in Europe at that point. Others like Van Tongelu, who was a sort of forgotten and rather marginalized figure, living in poverty on the outskirts of Paris. Brancusi was still alive, and Camargo used to visit Brancusi in his studio, so on. So they were able to take a kind of the essence of the optimism and even utopianism of early abstraction back to Latin America, and then this extraordinary process happened whereby some people went into a sort of almost adulatory attachment to this European abstraction. Others looked at the whole phenomenon critically in order to decide what was applicable to, let's say, Brazilian conditions. I'm saying this took place in people's work, not necessarily in verbal argument. Then you have this phenomenon of neo-concretism, which took this lucid abstraction and turned it in another direction, which I think was very significant. It was the moment of the neo-concrete group, which then split up and everybody went their individual ways. Yeah, so one of them, well, perhaps one of the most significant statement you can take from the Neo-Concrete Manifesto written by Ferreira Goulart was that they were going to conceive of the artwork not in terms of a machine, but in terms of what they called a quasi-body, That was the model for them, and that kind of identified this meeting between the schematism of geometric abstraction and the attention to the body's experience, lived experience, which then became the direction in which Ligia Papi, Ligia Clark, Elio Gaspari particularly went. So I think what perhaps that's maybe the most original innovatory position that Brazilian artists adopted then was to make a new relationship between the cerebral and the sensuous, the body and the mind, which, as we know in the history of European culture, had tended to separate after the philosophy of Descartes and so forth. That Descartes had the idea that, you know, the process of thinking was in some way, the body was in some way irrelevant in the process of thinking. And I think the Brazilians contested this and sought for ways of expressing the essential interrelationship and impossible to separate nature of these two sides of the psyche. And that's when the story continued. Then I'd just like to say a word or two about the generation following Ligia and Elio, just to encapsulate it in them. Let's say the generation of Cil de Moreles, Dunga, Antonio Manuel, so on, was perhaps, in relation to European and American art, significant in another way. And this was that the phenomenon that's sort of generally described as conceptual art was one of those, again, an international movement with contributions from all over the world. This is again a thing which is always hard to realize from European and North American art history, the global nature of such movements. Even here, even today, conceptual art is generally thought of as an American and European phenomenon. But of course it was being generated in its own way in countries like Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela and so on. And if you looked at the international survey, the first international surveys of conceptual art that were made in Europe in the late 60s, 69, and a prominent example of that was the show called Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, that was curated by Harold Zeman, who was a Swiss curator and probably an outstanding European curator of that period. He made a pioneering show of conceptual art that didn't include a single Latin American artist in the show. Elio Gaspari and Cil de Moreles were included in an important show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1970 called Information, which led to a very interesting response both from Gaspari and Cil de Moreles about the experience of participating in that show. But that's another story. The European conceptual art and American tended to be quite concerned with self-referential questions, questions of representation, self-referential questions of art language, whereas the Latin Americans, from the beginning, had this interrelationship between the aesthetic and the political, manifested individually differently in each artist's work, but that was already present, although it wasn't evident to European curators. So I think tracing the history of that relationship and in terms of its difference is still an important process to investigate into its fine detail. Well, maybe these are some questions that we can come back to, and I think it's very interesting to consider art in Brazil in relation to the international context as well as the national context, and try to see the way these two things interact. Okay.
Well, let's now switch to Portuguese. Portuguese. First of all, I want to thank José Falcone for the invitation, for this conversation that we are having now. And I am really flattered to be here with so important intellectuals like Elio Gaspari, Guy Brett, and Nicolau Sevcenko. I'm going to present, to show you a sequence of selected slides of Arthur Bispo do Rosario's works. All these pictures were taken by Galopido and Marcos Ribeiro. This first one is canecas, mugs in English. It's another point of view. And okay. I don't have a better picture for this, but it's sapateira. In English would be shoes rack. It's, no, this is bolsas, handbags. Yeah. This sapateira, shoes rack with sandals and lots of different shoes. These are cartolinas. I don't know the name for this, but it would be rolls of paper. It's a specific name in Portuguese. Cartolina is a kind of paper that we use for posters or things like that. Yeah? Cardboard? No, it's not cardboard. No, okay. They are in rolls. They are specific because they are in rolls, not cardboard like a box. Yeah. And this is a different point of view. Borrachas, a rubber, and it's a very interesting. It's a very small piece called the podium. It's a kind of we can play with the word, with the syllables. We can, for example, we would say that in English, only one can. Yeah? Pode Only one can. It's wood, piece of wood. It's a really small piece of wood. And we have the first place and the second. And this one is uma obra tão importante que levou 1986 anos para ser escrita. Such an important work that it took 1,986 years to be written. It was, in fact, copied from an encyclopedia ad in Veja magazine. It was an ad with a history of Jesus, and he made a kind of embroidery with this. Well, let's
Go back to the
here.
down like that.
Well, after this I'm going to share with you a metaphor used by Benedict Anderson in his book, The Spectre of Comparison. Anderson was once in the Philippines teaching himself to read Spanish using José Rizal novels, No Limite Tangere. At some point, the hero of the novel, who was recently returned from Europe, looks to the municipal gardens and finds that the gardens are shadowed mechanically, he said, and inescapable by images of their sister gardens in Europe. he can no longer experience them as he had before, but only see them simultaneously, close up and from afar, as an inverted telescope. This specter, he called El Demonio de las Comparaciones, the demon of comparisons, will haunt all movements from the colonies in relation to the metropolitan countries. In other words, our production would be affected by the demon of comparisons, an incurable double vision that produces a sensation of inadequacy in relation to work done at the other end of the telescope. This metaphor is very rich in possibilities for discussing some problems about Bispo's position. First, when we contemplate Bispo's works, we are immediately reminded of important icons of contemporary art, such as Armand, or for example Marcel Duchamp. I don't have this picture here, but Bispo has Roda da Fortuna, Wheels of Fortune, which is a wheel like a Duchamp wheel, a tropical wheel. As well as Oldenburg, Morris, or Cildo Meirelles, or like Podium, for example, or Joseph Kosuth, if we want, or whatever. Eva Ries, for example. To compare is compulsive in this case. I don't know if you know, but Bispo lived for 50 years, from 1939 to 1989, when he died, at Colônia Juliano Moreira, where his works are being kept right now. We don't know precisely when he built such and such piece. During these 50 years, he left the hospital to live with some families, and in the beginning of the 60s, we know, he lived in a medical clinic where he had a small bedroom and where nobody was allowed in to get in there. When he was moved to Colônia again in 1962, and this time for the rest of his life, it was necessary for 2 trucks to move his works from this place. Then we know that before this date and after this date we have this, the works. Due to Bispo's lack of self-awareness in relation to art itself, because he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. And his work may provide a means of avoiding the demon of comparison, rather as if we were to discover original, a genuine and unique work with no comparative. Indeed, Bispo was not producing art for anyone except for God and his beloved Rosângela Maria, who was an intern in the hospital. There was no struggle with concepts, schools, or artistic tradition. Thus, his art becomes incomparable, worth of being raised to the category of uncommon Brazilianness. Consequently, the notion of original appears as an imaginary support for the receptor amazed by the unknown, and inversely, it may be considered of extreme importance in recognizing the splendor or imposing authority of this little-known artist. Bispo's works, within the logic of originality, may be seen as a defense mechanism to the demon of comparison. The telescope, again, is used to enlarge the other end, but without the inconvenience of someone viewing our shrunken images through the big lens. Well, the whole apparatus is reinforced precisely by the fragility of cultural alterity, otherness. don't have in English authority. It's otherness. Of Bispo as author. When we recall that original also means primitive, here we have a dangerous and sensitive assertion. Brazilian art in general is an obsequious imitation of the other people's garden. It is only original when it is primitive and conceived as exotic. The consequences are disastrous, since the notion is a fallacy in relation to the Brazilian artist's work. I would say that it's a kind of ignorance of our production. To assume this position would be a step in direction of Bispo's work degenerating into craftwork curiosity for gringos. This position is an effect from the knowledge expected by the artists. The artist brings knowledge that is, in some way, surprising for receptors. Obviously, it becomes impossible to quantify this knowledge, but it is supposed to be knowledge that knows itself, or, if we want, its negative version, knowledge that does not know itself. And the artist, in this case, appears as herald of knowledge, to which the artist Arthur Bispo do Rosário would not have had access. Taking this direction, there are two positions and two receptions. A position of the artist who knows about himself as an artist. That include, for example, mad artists like Van Gogh or Antonin Artaud, or whatever, and that of Bispo. But placed side by side, without a barrier, confining their works to the domains of the unconscious, one expects dislocation of reception, not just in the sense of looking at Bispo do Rosário from the point of view of contemporary art, but contrariwise, or conversely, viewing art in slippage, in the most profound absence of assurances. This move brings out what Jacques Lacan described as the great secret of psychoanalysis. There is no other of the other. Nothing assures receptors that this is art, except a sort of conviction or confidence in the play of the presence and absence they encounter. Ultimately, the play is in the gaze and in the cultural construction of the play that is in progress. Just as Bispo's works was created without any message for the world, since there are several messages, contemporary art is produced in the most astonishing delirium, ordered in form of art. Summarizing, this move implies a glimpse, a quick look of an absence of assurances and intention in the construction of art. This way, Bispo's work, instead of being included in categories such as madness, exotic, and eccentric, can be conceived as an otherness for the thinking about art.
Okay. I'll invite you to, let's go back to 1968, at the time that Elio Gaspari made a work, it's a banner, yellow fabric, with a corpse, a killed person, and saying, be a marginal, be a hero. Seja marginal, seja herói. This is probably the most known work by Elio. I think that many people remembers it and even knows that it's by Elio. In '68, when the dictatorship in Brazil was a little bit ashamed, this banner was put in a very trendy nightclub. And it built a scandal, and Caetano Veloso was there, and Caetano Veloso was a partner of Gilberto Gil, the present Minister of Culture. And then the history, it grows. It's the marginal hero is the Brazilian flag. Caetano danced involved in the Brazilian flag. Caetano danced involved in the Brazilian flag at the sound of national anthem with Tropicalia's music. And the result of this, in span of months, it comes in the suppression of freedoms in Brazil. It calls Institutional Act number 5. Caetano and Gil were arrested, shaved, and exiled in London, not because of this, including because of this, but also because this is in the trend what they did all that time. And let's never forget that the name Tropicalia, that designed their movement, was coined by Elio Gaspari. They went to London, they lived there, and Elio Gaspari also went. Elio Gaspari, I think he didn't fled. I think that the situation was very strained, and he went, I knew today, that by boat, because he had no money for a plane. But let's go back now to the banner. It is supposed to be a celebration of a bandit. His name is Cara de Cavallo, horse face. Cara de Cavallo was killed in 65 or 66. He was a small bandit from Mangueira. Mangueira is not proper to say that Mangueira was a slum. Mangueira is a popular neighborhood near the big stadium in Rio and the house of very good sambas. The school of samba of Mangueira is the most traditional and at the same time the most beautiful and ugliest. That makes Mangueira special. And Elio went to Mangueira and became a friend of Cara de Cavallo. And he could go to Mangueira, at that time he could and we could go to Mangueira at any place there. And Cara de Cavallo was killed because he killed a cop that I tend to believe that the cop was giving protection to it's jogo do bicho, gambling. Yeah, illegal gambling. Then the cop was hired by the gamblers. Cara de Cavallo wanted to attack the gamblers and he killed the cop. This is one hypothesis. The second is that they killed the cop because he was trying to rob him. This cop is, his name is Lecoq. It's very fashionable to have a French name in a situation like that.
And not only because of French name.
And the killing of Lecoq built Scuderia Lecoq. That's a civil society institution that has an emblem, is a skull with two bones, and EM. EM means death squad. This is at this time, this moment, the illegal death squad in Brazil is born. I mean illegal because before 63, you had the legal death squad. That means 12 policemen that, like James Bond, had the license to kill. No, but this, from, let's say, Kubitschek's government in 55, 56 to 63, you have the killers, but there is a connection between the killers and the state. After that, the killers are on their own, but also they are centralized. The killings that we find now, the chacinas, where they killed 30 people today, there is anarchy of that squad. That 5 policemen, they want to kill 10, 20, 30, and they go in the poor neighborhoods and they kill. That's what happened in Brazil from the first death squad to the chacinas is a corruption of the police. And okay, Cara de Cavallo was killed in August '64. It's very interesting because Brazilian bandits, in some cases, become famous here. Also, there is a famous poem by Elizabeth Bishop. Mentions The Burglar of Babylon. And it's a very beautiful poem where she says that the bandit was killed at the shooting during the capture. Wrong. He was killed hours later inside of a car. Then this practice that is starting with the action of the police. And what I want to say, all this happened in '68. We are in 2005, and we can say, first, Elio Gaspari never could show his manner. No trendy nightclub will show a flag saying, be a marginal, be a hero. If Elio tried to do this, he will find a strong reaction from the society. Second, Elio could not meet Cara de Cavallo because the relations of, let's say, white Brazilian artists that go to some places of Mangueira today, it's impossible that he makes a relationship with the marginal. This notion of marginal as hero, I think that we must handle one point. Is not this one of the reasons that Rio de Janeiro become what it's become? There are hundreds of factors, but the people that go to the trendy nightclubs today, they want to kill all Cara de Cavallos and all Elio Gaspari that becomes his friends. I'll give you an example. The newspaper O Globo published the other day a photo of a bugger. Now, and 2 hours later after his arrest, and he was destroyed. It was the stronger reaction of the readers against the newspaper. Hundreds of emails, all of them saying, what do you want? Do you want to protect this man? Why do you fight for the human rights of the robbers? This is the situation that we live today in Rio. And I invite you to think about this art and society. This is what happened there. And at the same time, I would like to mention Ligia Pape. She was a very good friend of Elio. They fought most of the same fights, but there is a difference in their works. I think that Ligia always speaks very low key. This low key we'll find in 2003. There was a book on her, and she mentioned that in 1973 she had some sort of involvement with leftist organizations. She was arrested. I'm quite convinced that she was tortured. And she made this terrific line. I never spoke about this. 40 years later, 30 years later, I never spoke about this. Could seem romantic and at the same time opportunistic. I think that there is a difference in the two kinds of production, I think. Ligia's cerebral and Elio with this some sort of apotheotic vision, but I don't know if Rio was the wrong city for Elio Gaspari or Elio Gaspari was the wrong artist or the time. But the point is that the two cities, the city that we had in 1968 and the city we have today, it's very difficult for us to explain how that happened. Thank you.
So we would like to take questions. If you, or
Sort of a conversation, so
yeah,
feel free to. Yes.
I'd like to hear from the panelists. From what I've read, especially about Elio Gaspari, he had a very ambiguous relationship with Brazil. At the same time that he loved Mangueira and he loved all the experience he had there, he also complained a lot about Brazil, especially in his letters to Ligia Clark. So at the same time that he saw himself as a Brazilian artist, he also sort of denied this specificity of being Brazilian. And I think he had this aim of being a worldwide artist. And especially to Nicolau, at the same time that you said that Elio Gaspari never really needed support from public or private, he had a very tough time managing his work, and he complained a lot about not having the support. So how do you think that the Brazilian state or any other firms or anything can help support art in Brazil, or if it's not their role?
I think that Guybrecht is in a much better position than I to comment on the way by which Elio Gaspari managed to live the life of an artist, which was not part of any systematic, which didn't keep any systematic relationship either to the market or the state, because he knew him personally and he can tell by his personal experience. And at the same time, I guess he is also in the best position to comment on the question on of how Elio Gaspari felt about Brazil, about being Brazilian, about relating to Rio de Janeiro, in the same lines that Elio Gaspari was commenting, because of course he lived a very bad life. He didn't get support. His art was not properly appreciated. He had to get enormous resistance because of his kind of art, which was considered to be too kind of cosmopolitic or too much confrontational, in the sense that Elio was also telling. And in that sense, as Elio put it, he perhaps somehow felt that he was the wrong guy in the wrong place by that time. But I'm pretty sure that Guybrecht is more learned than I to comment on that. The last thing that I would like to mention is the final of your, the last part of your question, which is there a chance for an artist in Brazil in a moment? I don't know. I guess there is little chance for an artist with a good character, with a good consciousness. If you are good to sell yourself, go ahead, go for it. You're gonna make it. But then, if you have scruples, well, perhaps you're gonna be in the same position that Elio Gaspari was. You're not going to be very welcome, and you're not going to be really appreciated. We are not all of us here commenting on how great he was, but that was not the impression when he was alive. He was very much at odds with his people, with his city, with his environment, so much so that he preferred to travel abroad as much as he could. So that in many senses it is quite tragic, and the way he died, I think, has much to do with this rejection that he suffered. And it's only sad to know that it took so long for his work to be appreciated, and that something quite similar is still happening today with very talented young people who do not have any chance to get the work appreciated. Okay.
Yes, I think that's all perfectly true. In relation to Elio's making a living, he didn't really, I mean, he wanted to operate outside the art gallery, the museum system. So he was not really interested in gallery exhibitions, and he wasn't really interested in selling his work. So as a result, he gave some pieces away to friends. He sometimes gave a work to